Many of us don't believe black magic exists. We'd rather explain everything with science, psychology, stress, or coincidence. I used to be that guy too. 55 years old, American commercial airline pilot, the type who trusts instruments, checklists, weather radar, and what can be measured. But I beg to differ now because I watch something I still can't put into any flight manual or medical journal. And the worst part is this. If it's real, it's not always done by strangers in dark corners. Sometimes it's done by the nearest person in your life, the one who knows your routines, your fears, your soft spots, the kind of person who can ruin you without ever raising a hand. My name is Daniel Mercer. I fly for a major US carrier, mostly domestic routes with occasional international turns. I've lived through storms over the Rockies, microbursts near Dallas, and that one miserable winter night landing in Chicago when the runway looked like a frozen mirror. None of that rattled me the way a single night market outside New Orleans did. It started as a throwaway conversation with a friend from my earlier cargo days, a guy named Travis who had that restless daredevil streak. We met for coffee near the airport during one of my layovers. He looked older, leaner, eyes brighter in a way that made me think he'd swapped sleep for curiosity. Travis leaned in like he was about to tell me a secret and said there's a market you can visit if you really want to see what people mean. When they say voodoo, vodou, Haitian, Haitian voodoo, voodoo Haitian, voodoo Haitiano, all of it. He said it wasn't the tourist stuff, no cute voodoo doll keychains, no staged Haitian voodoo ceremony for a camera, no loud gimmicks. This was quiet, raw, and the kind of place where people came for real cures, talismans, and things they were too ashamed to say out loud. I laughed because I'm a pilot and I've heard every superstition under the sun. Lucky coins, lucky ties, lucky socks. I said I've seen more paranormal claims in horror stories than in real life. Travis didn't laugh back. He said, "Dan, I'm not selling you a horror story movie. I'm telling you there's a village market that opens after sunset and you'll never look at the word voodoo the same way again." My wife, Claire, was the reason I didn't brush it off. Claire loves thrill rides, creepy museums, scary story podcasts, lighthouse horror legends, and those late-night rabbit holes where she watches horror stories animated or some ridiculous Roblox horror clip and then pretends she's not scared. She's the type who can quote American Horror Story like scripture and still fall asleep before the end of a horror movie because she's too comfortable. When I told her about Travis's market, she set down her phone and said, "So you're saying there's a real-life American horror show happening near New Orleans, and you want to act normal about it?" I said, "It's probably junk, tourist bait, like those places selling voodoo dolls next to Louisiana voodoo fries." Claire grinned. "Still, let's go. I want to see the voodoo stories people whisper about, not the ones printed on postcards." We had a weekend free. I had a few days off between rotations. We flew into Louis Armstrong New Orleans International, rented a car, and spent the afternoon in the city. New Orleans was its usual self: humid air, music from open doors, history pressed into every street corner. Claire bought a little charm at a shop in the French Quarter, not a voodoo doll, just a cheap trinket, and joked that it would keep us safe. She hummed Black Magic Woman by Santana while we walked, then switched to Voodoo Child, the Hendrix Voodoo Child version, because she loves that riff. I rolled my eyes, but I'll admit it, New Orleans makes it hard to stay cynical. Just before dusk, we drove south and west along a narrower set of roads that Travis had scribbled on a napkin. The city thinned out. The lights changed from storefront neon to scattered porch bulbs. Cypress trees leaned over the road like they were listening. We passed water channels that looked still enough to be painted. Claire said, "If we end up in a swamp and a banjo starts playing, I'm blaming you." I said, "You're the one who wanted thrilling experiences." She tapped the dashboard like it was a drum. "Voodoo people," she sang under her breath, teasing me with a mashup of songs: Voodoo Ray, Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, and some random voodoo song she'd found online. Then she got quiet, like even she could feel the air changing. The village didn't have a sign, not one that said welcome, not one that said anything. It was a cluster of old buildings, a few trailers, and one long dirt lot behind what used to be a church, judging by the shape of the roof and the dead cross shadow on the front wall. The sun slipped away, and the world turned blue-gray. We parked. The lot was half full, and people were stepping out of cars with the kind of focus you see at a hospital entrance. Not excited, not curious, needing. Claire whispered, "This already feels wrong." I said, "It's just a night market." But then I noticed the rule. No stalls were open while there was daylight. Everything was covered in cloth. Everything. Like the place was holding its breath until the sun died. And the moment the last slice of orange vanished behind the trees, hands moved like a signal had been given. Cloths came off tables, lanterns lit, small oil flames flared. The market opened the way a mouth opens. I'd been expecting something loud. Instead, it was quiet, except for murmurs and the low shuffle of feet. The smell hit me first. Not decay, not exactly. More like dried herbs, smoke, damp wood, old leather, and something metallic that made the back of my throat tighten. Some stalls looked like folk medicine. Bundles of roots, jars of powders, bottles with handwritten labels. Others were worse. Skulls, bones, feathers, animal parts that looked dried and preserved. I saw what might have been dried lizards, snakes, birds, things I didn't want to identify. It reminded me of photos I'd once seen of a West African fetish market, the kind people call a landmark, the kind that draws seekers of cures and ritualistic goods. Only this wasn't Lomé, Togo, West Africa. This was Louisiana backroad America, and somehow that made it feel even more unnatural. Claire tried to whisper jokes to keep her courage up. She said, "If I see Pepper from American Horror Story behind a stall, I'm running." I said, "Don't be disrespectful." She nodded, but she was gripping my arm. I could feel her pulse through her fingers. People moved from stall to stall, like they were following invisible instructions. Some asked for help, some begged, some just held out money and stared at the vendor like they were surrendering. A woman with a swollen face held a small bag to her chest like it was her last hope. A man with trembling hands kept saying he needed a removal, remove black magic, like it was a diagnosis. We stopped at one stall where a middle-aged vendor with tired eyes spoke softly. On the table were small cloth bundles, carved charms, and a few items that looked like classic voodoo doll shapes, but stitched in a way that felt older than novelty. Claire leaned closer, fascinated. The vendor asked what we were looking for. Claire said, "Just observing. We're curious." The vendor stared at her and said, "Curiosity gets people hungry for things they can't digest." I stepped in and said we meant no harm. We were visitors. The vendor nodded slowly, then said, "If you're here for music, go back to the city. If you're here for healing, be careful who you ask. Not everyone sells help. Some sell hunger." As we walked away, I heard faint music somewhere deeper in the market. A warped little speaker playing something that sounded like Godsmack, then a jump into voodoo Godsmack riffs, then abruptly switching to a scratchy Stevie Ray Vaughan track. SRV doing voodoo chili, or at least trying to. It was like the market itself was mixing songs to mock the word voodoo. Claire said, "Okay, creepy playlist, noted." We kept moving. 40 minutes passed, maybe a bit more. I tracked time the way pilots do automatically, and that's when I realized something strange. Most stalls had a crowd, at least a few people, but one stall, tucked near the edge where the lantern light thinned, had none. No customers, no conversation, just a table, a canopy, and a woman sitting behind it like she'd been waiting for a specific pair of footsteps. Claire slowed. I felt her tug my sleeve. The woman was very old, not sweet grandma old, old like dried parchment. Her hair was thin and white, pulled back tight. Her face had deep lines that looked carved rather than wrinkled. Her eyes were the worst part, pale, watchful, and too awake. On her table were glass jars. Dozens, some small, some large, each one sealed with wax. Each one had something inside that didn't look like herbs or powder. Some jars held cloudy liquid, others held what looked like folded scraps of paper. Some held a dark thread coiled like a sleeping worm. A few seemed empty, but my skin prickled when I looked at them, like empty was the lie and full was the truth. Claire breathed, "This is the I work at a half-priced voodoo shop vibe, but upgraded to nightmare." I said, "Quiet." The woman didn't greet us, didn't advertise, didn't smile. She watched. I cleared my throat and asked what she sold. Her voice came out thin but steady. Not items, exchanges. I said, "Exchanges of what?" She tilted her head as if listening to something behind my ribs. "Souls." Claire let out a nervous laugh, the kind people do when they hope reality will back down if they pretend it's a joke. She said, "Like, metaphorically, like love spells, voodoo love spells." The woman blinked slowly. "Love is cheap. Souls are not." I felt the rational part of me reaching for explanations. Performance, scam, psychological manipulation. But my chest felt tight and I couldn't tell if it was fear or the smell of smoke and herbs. I asked what was in the jars. The woman said, "Agreements, names, breath." Claire whispered, "This is not normal." The woman's gaze shifted to Claire. She said, "You brought a bright one. Bright ones are fun." Claire stiffened. I stepped closer to block that look. The woman's hands rested on the table, nails yellowed, fingers long. She tapped a jar with a fingernail. The sound was sharp, like glass being threatened. She said, "People come to me when doctors say no, when sickness is serious, when the body is failing and the person would not recover ever, they ask for replacement." "Replacement what?" I asked. She said, "Replacement souls, a new passenger for a broken plane." I hated how she used my language. She didn't know I was a pilot. I hadn't told her. Claire hadn't either. Claire asked how that worked. The woman leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped. "I do not heal flesh. I trade what sits behind it." I said, "That's not real." She stared at me and said, "Many of us do not believe. Then we learn belief is not required. Only proximity." My skin went cold. Claire swallowed and said, "Are you saying you steal souls?" The woman corrected her. "Buy, sell, capture, release. People always say steal when they hate the price." I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed to walk away, get back to the car, drive back to a bright street with restaurants and noise. But Claire, in that brave, curious way of hers, asked the question that opened the door. She asked, "Is it all done here?" The woman's lips twitched, not a smile, more like a crack in a stone. "Here is the shop. The work is at my home." Claire glanced at me. Her eyes said thrill, her mouth said caution. I said no. I said we were done. The woman said, "You came for a thrilling experience. Now you want to pretend you're too clean for it." Claire's voice came out smaller. "We're not trying to disrespect." The woman nodded once. "Good. Then you can witness. Witnessing is not doing. Come. You will see how people beg and how they pay and why they leave lighter." I should have refused. I should have taken Claire's hand and walked away. Instead, I did the dumbest thing a rational man can do. I thought, if I see it, I can debunk it. If I see it, I can explain it scientifically. So we followed her. Her house sat beyond the market, down a narrow path where the lantern light didn't reach. The night felt thicker there. Crickets were loud, then suddenly not loud at all, like even the insects knew when to shut up. Inside, the air was cooler. The smell was stronger. Herbs, smoke, and something sweet that made me think of rot trying to disguise itself. The walls were cluttered with hanging bundles. There were symbols scratched into wood. On a shelf, I saw names written on paper, stacked like flight manifests. There were other people in the room already. A couple, middle-aged, eyes red from crying, a young man with a bandaged hand, an older woman with a cane and a cough that sounded too deep. They didn't look like thrill seekers. They looked desperate. The old woman motioned for everyone to sit. Her movements were slow but confident, like she'd done this 1,000 times and the room belonged to her more than the furniture did. She spoke in a language I didn't recognize for a moment, then switched to English. She said names quietly, like calling passengers to board. The couple begged her for help. The woman said their daughter was dying. Doctors had said there was nothing left. They needed a cure. They needed a trade. The old woman asked what they brought. They brought a jar. It was sealed, waxed, and labeled with a name. The name looked handwritten, shaky. I couldn't tell if it was their own or someone else's. My stomach turned. Claire whispered, "Dan, we should go." I whispered back, "Watch, just watch." The old woman began what I can only describe as a ritual, but I won't give you steps because even telling it feels like putting a match to dry grass. I'll tell you the feeling instead. The room seemed to tilt. The air felt pressurized, like before turbulence. The lantern flame bent without wind. The coughing woman stopped coughing for a full minute, like her lungs were waiting for permission. The old woman touched the jar and murmured names I'd heard in documentaries and jokes, names people toss around without respect. Baron Vodou, Ezili Dantor, Freda Azuli. She said them not like characters, but like keys. The young man with the bandaged hand started trembling. His eyes rolled back. His lips moved like he was trying to speak but couldn't get the words out. The old woman's voice sharpened. She demanded something. The young man suddenly exhaled hard, like he'd been holding his breath underwater, and one of the empty jars on the shelf, the one that had looked harmless, fogged from the inside. A faint, cloudy swirl formed like breath on glass. Claire grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. I tried to tell myself it was humidity, chemistry, heat. The market had been hot. The room was cooler, glass fogs, that's science. But then the jar made a sound, a tiny, soft tap from inside like a fingernail on glass. I froze. The old woman looked straight at Claire and me. She said, "You see, capture is easy when the target is already cracked." The couple cried with relief as the coughing woman in the corner inhaled, deep and clean, like her lungs had been swapped out. Her eyes widened. She whispered, "Thank you," over and over. The old woman didn't look pleased. She looked bored. She reached for a tray and poured something into 2 cups. The liquid was dark, like tea, but thicker. The smell was sweet and bitter at the same time. She offered it to us. Claire shook her head. "No, thank you." The old woman said, "You came to witness. Witnessing is thirsty work. I said we were fine." Her eyes narrowed. "You fear me?" I said, "I don't fear you. I don't believe you." She nodded slowly. "Then you will enjoy the game." "Game?" Claire asked. The old woman set the cups down anyway and began speaking again, softer, faster. The lantern flame bent again. My ears filled with a faint buzzing, like the low hum you get in a cockpit when the systems are on and the world outside is silent. Claire whispered, "Dan, I feel weird." I turned to her, and her pupils looked slightly larger, like the room was drinking her. I stood up. "We're leaving." The old woman's voice rose, "Not leaving yet." I felt something tug in my chest. Not pain, not physical, more like a hand reaching through me, trying to grab something that didn't have edges. Claire swayed. The old woman smiled, and this time it was a real smile, sharp and delighted. "Strong enough," she said. "If you are strong enough, your souls will not be captured." I said, "Stop." She said, "No, you wanted proof. Here is proof. You wanted thrilling experience. Here is the thrill." Claire's knees buckled. I caught her. I shouted her name, and my voice sounded wrong in that room, like the walls were absorbing it. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed Claire, turned and walked out. I didn't run. I forced myself to move like I was still in control, like a pilot walking down the aisle, calm, while the plane shakes. Behind us, the old woman laughed softly and said, "If you carry it home, it grows better." We made it back to the car. Claire sat shaking, staring at her hands like they weren't hers. I drove back toward New Orleans with my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. Claire finally spoke. "Dan, I feel like something followed us." I said, "It's adrenaline, fear. That woman is a manipulator." Claire looked at me. "Then why do I taste smoke?" I didn't answer. That night in our hotel, Claire woke up screaming without sound, her mouth open, eyes wide, but nothing coming out. I shook her. She snapped back like she'd been underwater. She sat up and said, "I saw jars, rows of jars, and one had my name." The next day I felt it too, not a dream, not imagination. Small things started happening that made no sense. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked delayed by half a beat, like a bad video buffer. My phone lit up with a weird notification at 3:17 a.m. that made no sense, then vanished before I could read it. Claire swore she heard tapping from inside our suitcase. Tap, 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 like a fingernail on glass. I tried to distract us. We walked the city, ate beignets, listened to street music. A band played a swing number that reminded Claire of Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, and she almost smiled. But then she froze and said she heard a whisper under the trumpet, a voice repeating our names like a flight attendant calling boarding. That night was worse. I dreamed I was in a cockpit that wasn't mine. The instruments weren't labeled with altitude and speed. They were labeled with names. I tried to pull back on the yoke, and the plane wouldn't climb because something heavy was in the cabin. When I turned around, the seats were full of glass jars, each one fogged from the inside. I woke up choking, like I'd been breathing through wax. Claire woke up with bruises on her wrists, shaped like fingers. 2 days after the market, I reported for a short repositioning flight, thinking work would ground me in reality. Planes are honest. Planes respond to physics. Planes don't care about folklore. But as I walked onto the aircraft, I had the sudden sick certainty that I wasn't alone in my own skin. It was the same tugging sensation, like something inside me was being tested, like a lock being picked. I sat in the cockpit and stared at the windshield. For a second, just one, I saw the old woman's face reflected in the glass, even though she wasn't there. Her eyes looked amused, like she was watching a show. I blinked, and it was gone. I could have shrugged it off as stress. But then Claire called me while I was still on the ground and said, "Dan, the tapping is back. It's in the walls." I told the captain I wasn't fit to fly. I made up a medical excuse. Pride hates that sentence, but fear says it for you. We didn't sleep that night. The hotel felt wrong. The room temperature dropped randomly. The hallway light flickered like it was being breathed on. Claire stared at the corner where the ceiling met the wall and whispered, "There's something standing there." I said, "There's nothing." She said, "Don't lie to me like you're lying to yourself." On the third day, Claire broke down crying, not because she was scared, but because she said she felt empty in a way she couldn't explain, like someone had scooped out her laughter and left the shell. She said she couldn't remember the sound of her own childhood home. She said she couldn't picture her mother's face clearly anymore. Memories were fading, like photos left in sunlight. That's when I stopped being stubborn. I didn't go back to the market. I didn't try to confront the old woman. I did something I never thought I'd do. I asked for spiritual help. New Orleans has plenty of people who claim they can fix anything for cash, but I wasn't looking for a show. I was looking for someone who didn't smile too fast. A bartender we'd met earlier, a man with kind eyes who'd overheard Claire mention voodoo, gave us a name. He said there's a priest who understands both worlds, church and old ways. He won't mock you. He won't exploit you. He'll tell you the truth even if you don't like it. We met the priest in a small, plain building that looked like it had been there longer than asphalt. He was not dramatic, not theatrical, No movie version of exorcism. Just a tired man with steady hands and a gaze that made you feel seen. He listened without interrupting. When I described the jars, his face tightened slightly. When I described the tea, he frowned. He asked if we accepted anything from her. Claire said we didn't drink it. The priest nodded once. Good. But you took something anyway. You took her invitation. That counts. I asked if this was real. I asked if black voodoo, black magic, whatever people call it, could really do what we were feeling. The priest's answer was simple. Belief is not the door. Attention is. He told us some people use voodoo as religion, community, healing, protection. He said not everything labeled voodoo is evil, but he also said there are people who weaponize fear, who twist tradition into predation. He called it hunger, the same word the vendor at the market had used. He said the old woman sounded like a soul trader, the kind who bargains with desperate people and feeds on the curious. He said she doesn't always take everything at once. Sometimes she takes a piece, a sliver, enough to weaken you, enough to make you come back begging, or enough to make you carry that weakness home like a parasite. Then he did what the old woman did not. He asked our permission. He prayed over us. He used words that felt like warm light, not like keys turning in a lock. He gave us salt and a small bundle of herbs and told us to cleanse our space, not with a complicated ritual, but with intention and discipline. He warned us not to speak the old woman's name, not to replay her voice in our heads, not to feed the memory. He said, think of it like turbulence. Panic makes it worse. You stabilize, you breathe, you ride it out, you follow procedure. For the first time in days, Claire's shoulders dropped like she'd been carrying a weight she didn't know how to describe. That night, the tapping stopped. The next morning, Claire laughed at something small, a stupid joke on TV, and the sound of her laughter made my eyes burn because it felt like getting her back. We flew home after that. Real home. Our house, our bed, our normal routines. For 2 weeks, I almost convinced myself it was over. Stress response, shared panic, a bad night that spiraled. Then one evening I opened a kitchen cabinet and found a glass jar sitting on the shelf. We don't own jars like that. Not sealed with wax, not with a folded scrap of paper inside. Claire walked in behind me and froze so hard I could hear her inhale. On the paper inside the jar, in neat handwriting that wasn't mine, was a single line. Daniel Mercer. Strong enough? I didn't hear tapping. Not yet, but I could feel the weight of being noticed again, like the moment the cockpit systems power up and the plane becomes more than metal. Claire whispered, we didn't bring it home. And I realized the scariest truth of all. Maybe we didn't. Maybe it followed.